So today I'm going to tell you the secret that Nvidia doesn't want you to know, at least not out in the open, but we can obviously see it from very, factual observation of what they're doing, that this is true. We could even see stuff that they say. Remember, they said Moore's law is dead, but then AMD said it isn't, and they released some faster products. They're going to have that type of scaling competition for a while, but let's look at the root cause of what's causing high GPU prices, unsatisfactory products that are really bottlenecked in many ways, and it's going to point really to their hardware. And we're going to reveal the secret that it's obvious what Nvidia is doing, and to many people and many consumers it's really not. So if you watch any video related to Nvidia GPUs especially, you'll see that the sentiment towards Nvidia is not positive at all. Everybody's going to complain that they're either greedy or the products aren't really as good as they should be, the price is too high, or any combination of those, which is really a shame because they've made some of the best GPUs historically and they've had really exciting products. And now we feel like every new GPU release, and we're just waiting for the RTX 4060 Ti, that's probably going to be the low point for RTX 40 series, not only because of the price it's going to be way too high, but 8 gigabytes of VRAM. This starts to show you some of the huge problems that Nvidia has going on under the surface. So what is the main problem here? If Nvidia doesn't feel that on the hardware side, by saying that Moore's law is dead, they're going to have enough advancing technology to really make up for the gains that gamers want to see, and not only gamers, but all of the development that goes around graphics, it's in movies, it's in various different aspects. If they think the hardware is already at its limit, or at least it's not worth it developing any further, because or else you're going to get really expensive GPUs like the 4090, and while a lot of gamers appreciate that, it's still a small segment. Not everybody can afford those expensive GPUs. And now let's hear a word from our sponsor, VIP-CDKdeals.com, a Windows 10 Pro CD key. Add to cart, you put in code CC20. This will also work on Windows 11. You want to go into your settings in Windows, change and adjust your CD key, click activate, and now let's go back to the video. The bread and butter of GPUs, really, it's under $500, maybe even under $300. If you look at the amount of GPUs that people play on Steam, a lot of times it's like a 1650, maybe an RTX 3060 or 3050. So we're talking about, well under $400 in many cases. So here is what Nvidia is really doing. Let's take a look at some recent releases. 4070, 4070 Ti, for example. One big thing that they both have in common is that they both have some interestingly limited hardware specifications compared to their predecessors. If you look at a 3070, that's going to have a much faster memory bandwidth. Like we've said many different times, the 4070 Ti and the 4070 are only limited to 192 bits. But this isn't a discussion about VRAM and its limitations or its bandwidth. What Nvidia is doing here is starting to limit the hardware of the 70 class, which is one of the most popular segments of its GPU lineup. And then, of course, that trickles down to the 60 class, which is going to have even worse. Maybe something like a 4060 Ti will have like a 128-bit memory bus. So the hardware is limited. How is it going to play all of the games that are coming out? First of all, we have to accept that most PC games, even AAA titles from the biggest studios, are just unoptimized. That's part of what PC gaming is, I guess, nowadays. Every single game that's released in 2023 has been really unoptimized. It's been poor. So ideally, the games would be better made, but let's look at the reality here. They're rushing out these games, and if you want to enjoy these games, in a lot of cases, a lot of GPUs have a harder time if their hardware is going to be a lot more limited. A 4090 can put up with more unoptimized, frames per second, for example, than something like a 4070, which may falter much sooner and give you a much more unplayable experience. So that's one major thing the last few GPU releases from Nvidia have in common, those reduced hardware specifications. Now, if they're meant to play some of the newest games and actually be very competitive, Nvidia has to make up for that somewhere, right? That's where we look at the second thing that they have in common, and that's going to be DLSS. They're AI basically, they're deep learning super sampling. That's the technology that's going to take whatever whatever game you're playing, it's going to go to a lower resolution. And then with the AI magic, it's going to upscale it. It's going to make it look better than it would have if it were at a lower resolution. And of course, you're going to have some drawbacks like increased latency. You may have some artifacts. In general, nothing against the technology. It seems to work well for like AAA titles, first player games, for example, that you may play without having to be really competitive and have a very, very high, response time needed. So that's a different subject. But what Nvidia does here with DLSS, it makes a GPU like the 4070, for example, be able to play much more intense games, at least visually, what it's telling you with the frames per second and smoothing everything out than it normally would with its reduced specifications. So that's the second thing that the 4070 Ti and 4070 really have in common. Nvidia is pushing the software side more than ever. I mean, when other GPUs came out, they would mention DLSS 3, but then even the 4090, they would mention the brute force power of it compared to other GPUs. And obviously, when it does use DLSS 3, the difference is much, much greater, and it just makes it seem like an insane GPU. Like if you're looking at Flight Simulator 2020 and you look at the numbers for DLSS 3, for example, it's going to be well and above beyond anything else on the market for, DLSS 3 when you're comparing it on the 4090. So the same thing is true. AMD doesn't have anything but FSR2 at the moment, and that, while it does raise the frame rates, it doesn't do it to the amount that DLSS 3 does. Because of the AI interpolation, of course, because of the, frame generation, some people may call it fake frames, how it's inserting frames in order to make it seem like you're having really higher frames per second. But for most games, it does have an effect to make the gameplay smoother. It does definitely make it a better playable experience because the hardware will not be able to keep up with stuff like, ray tracing, overdrive, and cyberpunk without the help of DLSS 3. So Nvidia is really pushing that software side. That's their secret. While keeping the cost lower for the hardware on a GPU, if they put 12 gigabytes of VRAM on a GPU with 192-bit memory bus, that's a whole lot cheaper than having to put 24 gigabytes of VRAM, which with a much faster, like 384-bit memory bus or something like that, like they would do for a top-end GPU. So that's where they can save money and get people used to that class of GPU. On the other side, they're going to try to use the software to really pump up the numbers a little bit and make it seem like the GPU is actually better than it is. And I think going forward, especially for RTX 5000, that's probably going to be their strategy, because by then they're going to have gone through what we're seeing now, which is a pretty big drought in the GPU market with people not buying GPUs. So they don't really have incentive to release anything too soon or anything too crazy powerful, because that's just going to make the sales of RTX 4000 and RTX 3000, which is still out there in large numbers in many retailers, it's going to completely destroy those GPUs. So we're going to see a few years of like a pretty much stagnant GPU growth, in my opinion. And that means Nvidia not putting too much money into the hardware side of GPUs, and they're going to put all their resources to go on the AI side, such as DLSS 3, which for them is going to be a lot easier because they are already pumping out a lot of AI specific GPUs, such as, the H100, the GPUs that are meant specifically for artificial intelligence. So they're focusing on that market, which is more profitable and it's much more worldly, if you will, with many more industries taking advantage of it. So I think they're going to be focusing a lot more resources on that. And then basically they're just going to let gamers tag along with stuff like DLSS 3, with frame generation in order to make the games appear like they're getting a huge improvement. But on the hardware side, really not going to be nearly as impressive. I really don't think next generation we're going to see that big of a performance jump, even on like the 4090, 5090 side, because Nvidia is going to try to increase DLSS 3 even more. Who knows? We may get a technology like DLSS 4, for example, where it's only going to be effective on RTX 5000 because of specific hardware, which may be cheaper than making it a general hardware improvement than what we would normally expect for a GPU year over year. And then as it stands now, a lot of these GPUs aren't impressive. Like the 4070 compared to the 3080 of the previous generation, it's really neck and neck. You should really see the 4070 performing a few percentage points at least on average better than the 3080, but it really isn't. So that shows you that the only place where it will perform much better than a 3080 is DLSS 3. So Nvidia is hoping that gamers eat that up, but unfortunately that's not available on every single title, and the titles that it does have available in, we don't know if it's something that everybody's going to play, if people want the extra input latency. There are a lot of issues that make it a very interesting add-on, but it certainly should not be the main focus of selling a GPU. But in the future, I think Nvidia is going to try to sell it even more, probably work with developers more. A lot of developers are trying to either go to Nvidia or AMD when we see only FSR included. Some titles don't get DLSS. Some titles like DLSS 3, if they put it on games like Jedi Survivor, it seems like from some reports that we read, you do get a lot better performance. That's another issue entirely with game developers not putting in as much effort into games, hoping that stuff like DLSS 3 makes up for the lack of performance and optimization. All right, guys, so that's basically my opinion on what I think Nvidia is doing. Let me know what you think down below. Are they really going to push the software side much harder and leave the hardware really kind of unimpressive? Let's see what happens. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next video.